You know that moment when someone provokes you and you don't react, not because you controlled yourself, but because you simply didn't feel it, like the situation reached you and hit a pane of glass, and you watched from a distance, calm, thinking, I've grown, I've matured. Things like that don't get to me anymore. But what if that's not it? What if what you call maturity is, in reality, a wall so thick it no longer lets through even what should get through? Today we're going to talk about the difference between Stoic equanimity, that real strength Marcus Aurelius built over a lifetime, and the defensive emotional shutdown that so many people mistake for peace after 40, because these two things look identical from the outside, but on the inside, they're opposites. And understanding that difference can completely change how you see yourself. You're going to discover what the Stoics actually taught about feeling without being swept away. You're going to understand why the detachment you call wisdom may be costing you more than you realize. And you're going to hear the question that most people at this stage of life never stop to ask. Did what I walled off from the outside also get trapped on the inside? So stay until the end, because the answer to that question is not what you expect. Let's start with what you're probably living right now. You're no longer the person who exploded over anything, who lost sleep over a work argument, who carried the weight of a wrong word for days, who let someone else's mood determine yours, who walked out of a difficult meeting and spent the rest of the day replaying what you should have said. That's behind you. You learned through experience, through time, through pain, not to react on autopilot. And that's a real achievement. I'm not taking it away from you, but there's something that happens alongside it that almost no one names. As you became less reactive, you also became less present, laissez accessible, less entirely there in conversations, in relationships, in moments that ask more of you than the functional version. You're efficient, you're stable, you're in control, and at the same time, you're distant. From people, from situations that should move you, from parts of yourself that needed to stay alive. Imagine having a filter so powerful that nothing gets through. The world keeps being noisy. People keep being difficult. Situations keep being unpredictable, but none of it touches you. Sounds great, doesn't it? Sounds exactly like what the Stoics taught. But it isn't, because a filter that lets nothing through isn't protecting you. It's isolating you. And there's an enormous difference between being protected and being isolated, even when the two look the same from the outside. To understand that difference, you need to understand what the Stoics actually taught, not what most people think they taught. When you hear about Stoicism, the image that comes to mind is usually this: the unshakable sage who feels nothing, who doesn't react, who moves through life like a stone through water, leaving no mark, taking no mark. A kind of philosophical robot, cold by principle, distant by choice. That image is wrong. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. He lived surrounded by betrayals, wars, deaths. He buried children. He watched the empire threatened from within and without. He led armies while trying to be a present father, a just ruler, a man who wouldn't lose the thread of himself in the middle of chaos. And what he wrote for himself, not for the world, for himself, in the meditations, at night, when no one was watching, is not the record of a man who felt nothing. It's the record of a man who felt everything and kept standing. He wrote about gratitude, about beauty in simple things, about the constant effort to stay present, not to harden to keep seeing the people around him as human beings deserving of care, even when it was easier not to, even when he was exhausted, even when there were enough reasons to stop feeling anything at all. And he wrote this: "Do not be distressed by what happens, for things do not care about your judgments." That line is often quoted to justify emotional withdrawal, as if Marcus Aurelius was saying, don't feel, don't engage. Things don't deserve your emotional attention. But that's not what he's saying. He's talking about judgment, not feeling. He's saying that unnecessary suffering comes from how you interpret what happens, not from having been touched by it. You can be touched and not be destroyed. You can feel and still maintain your balance. You can be completely present in a difficult situation with everything it holds, with everything it asks, and come out the other side still being yourself. Marcus Aurelius didn't become unshakable because he stopped feeling. He became unshakable because he learned to feel without being swept away. And there's a lifetime of difference between those two things. So what is defensive emotional shutdown, and why is it so easy to confuse it with equanimity? Emotional shutdown is not a decision. It's a process. It happens in layers, over years, so slowly that you don't notice when you cross the line. It starts with a disappointment you decide not to repeat, then another, then a pattern that forms. Certain people don't deserve that much of you. Certain situations aren't worth the emotional cost. It's wiser to hold back than to give. And gradually, without consciously choosing it, the radius of access kept shrinking. First it closed to strangers, then to acquaintances, then, imperceptibly, it started closing to the closest people, to not out of ill will, but because the pattern no longer distinguishes. It just protects, in every direction, all the time. Today, few things truly get through, and you call this having gotten smarter. Stoic equanimity works differently. It doesn't shrink the radius of access, it deepens the ground. You don't pull away from things to avoid being hit. You build a foundation so solid that you can be hit without being knocked down. You're present. You feel. You engage, and none of that throws you off center, because the center exists, because you deliberately built it. Over time, with attention and practice. One is absence. The other is presence with roots. The person in equanimity and the closed-off person don't react the same way, don't get shaken the same way. If you observe from a distance, they look the same, but one of them is there. The other is behind glass. You didn't find peace, you found protection. Those are very different things. And here's what almost no one says about emotional shutdown. When you build a wall between yourself and the world, you're not just stopping things from the outside from getting in, you're stopping things from the inside from getting out. The problem isn't that you closed yourself off from the world. It's that you closed yourself off from parts of yourself that needed to stay alive. There's a version of you that wants to connect for real, that wants to be seen beyond what you normally show, that wants to say what it feels without calculating the risk first, that wants to be surprised by something, that wants a conversation to go on longer than necessary simply because it was good, not because there was something to resolve, not because there was a practical function in continuing, but because it was good and you were well inside it. That version hasn't disappeared. It got stuck on the wrong side of the wall, and sometimes it shows up in a moment of carelessness, in a song that arrives without warning, in an old photograph, in a smell that takes you back somewhere. For an instant, you're entirely present, entirely alive inside that moment. And then the usual reflex comes, the withdrawal, the return to safe distance, and you move forward, functional, in control. But the fact that it still shows up is important information. It didn't leave. It's waiting. This idea that Stoicism isn't about stopping feeling, but about learning to feel without losing yourself, is at the heart of what I put together in Stoicism in 30 days. It's not a book of quotes or philosophical summaries. It's a practice guide. 30 days, one chapter a day, each one with a real citation from Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, or Epictetus. A reflection applied to real life, not to theory, and an exercise to do before sleeping or when you wake up. Each day builds on the one before. The first week works on the control of what is yours. The second, emotions. The third, adversity. The fourth, relationships and time. The fifth, who you are becoming. Because understanding Stoicism is one thing, using it when the anger has already risen, when the relationship is asking more than you're giving, when the shutdown has become habit, that's something else entirely. The book just launched. The link is in the description, and in the first pinned comment there's a discount coupon. Now, back to what we were building here. Seneca wrote, "Withdraw into yourself as much as you can." For a long time, that line was read as praise for isolation, as if Seneca was saying, pull away from the world, protect yourself, reduce contact, cut exposure. But Seneca was talking about conscious withdrawal, something completely different from emotional shutdown. To withdraw is to go inside yourself to find clarity, to think, what you feel, what you want when the noise stops. Not to be carried away by the chaos outside, to reach yourself with attention, with care, and from that firmer, more whole, clearer place, return to the world with more presence, not less. To shut down is to go inside yourself to avoid having to deal with anything, not to be disturbed, not to risk being touched by something that will cost you emotionally, to maintain the comfort of not having to respond to what life asks. One is movement with intention, the other is immobility disguised as wisdom, and the difference between the two isn't always visible from outside. The person who withdraws consciously and the person who shut down out of fear look similar from a distance. Both are quiet, both seem serene, both went inside, but one of them will come out more present. The other will come out more distant for you. On the inside, you know which one is which. Think about how you are in your closest relationships right now, not the ones that are distant by nature, the colleagues, the acquaintances, the functional relationships that exist because they're necessary, the closest ones, partner, children, longtime friends, siblings, the people who should have access to the most complete version of you. Are you presenting them in a way you recognize as real, or are you present in a functional way? You show up, you're there, you handle what needs to be handled. You appear when necessary, but there's a pane of glass between you and what's happening. A subtle distance no one formally placed there, but that exists and that everyone feels, even without naming it, because emotional shutdown rarely destroys relationships in a dramatic way. There's no fight, no rupture, no clear moment when everything changed. It empties them slowly. The people around you sense that you're there, but not entirely. That when they try to get closer, there's a point where you stop corresponding, that your conversations are efficient, but rarely deep, that you're reliable, but not entirely reachable. And you, from the inside, feel a loneliness you can't quite name, because technically you're not alone. You have people, you have presence, but you also have this distance you created yourself and that you no longer know quite how to cross, or whether you want to, or whether crossing it is still possible. Sometimes, that loneliness shows up in the most unexpected moments, at a dinner full of people, when you notice you're there but not really, in a conversation with someone who's known you for years, when you notice it's been a long time since you said anything that was truly yours, anything that cost something, anything that came from a place that still hurts, or still wants, or still expects something. Stoicism doesn't ask you to ignore the risk of feeling. It asks you to be honest about what you're protecting and at what price. There is what depends on you, and there is what doesn't. What people will do with what you feel that doesn't depend on you. The risk of being misunderstood, of not being understood, of opening up and not receiving the same care back, of getting close and coming out hurt that doesn't depend on you. These things can happen, and when they happened before, they hurt in a way that justified the wall. But the choice of whether to be present or not, that depends on you. The emotional shutdown that so many people mistake for maturity is, in practice, an attempt to control the uncontrollable, an attempt to eliminate the risk of feeling something that hurts, of relating and coming out hurt, of exposing yourself and being rejected or misunderstood. And it worked in the sense that the risk decreased. But in trying to eliminate the risk, you also eliminated the possibility of being truly seen, of feeling something worth feeling, of being somewhere in a way that will matter to you, to whoever was there with you when that moment has passed, and you can no longer go back to it. You've built something very solid. The question is, what got left on the outside and what got trapped on the inside? The wall isn't the problem in itself. You built it for real reasons. It protected things that needed protection at moments when you had no other way out. That doesn't need to be denied or ashamed of, but a wall built to protect cannot become a prison. And often, over time, without you noticing exactly when, that's what happens. What was protection becomes habit. What was habit becomes identity. And identity starts to feel like truth, as if you'd always been this way, as if this distance were who you are, as if there were no other way to be in the world. It isn't true, but to see that, you need to look at the wall honestly, not with guilt, not with urgency to tear it down tomorrow, just with clarity about what it is and what it's costing you. Epictetus said, "Difficulty shows what men are, not as an accusation, as an observation. When things get hard, when a relationship asks more of you than you're used to giving, when a conversation asks you to step outside the safe zone, when someone gets close enough to truly see you and expects you to get close to what you do in that moment shows who you are being, not who you were, not who you could be in an ideal scenario where there's no risk and no cost, who you are being now, at this specific stage of life, with everything you carry and everything you've learned. And the answer to that question isn't judgment, it's Information. It's the most honest thing you can know about yourself right now. More honest than any description you give of yourself to others. More honest than the version of you that shows up when everything is controlled and nothing is asking more than you're willing to give. Difficulty shows what men are, and seeing that clearly without defending yourself, without minimizing, without turning it into a more palatable story, is the beginning of anything worth building from here forward. Not as punishment, as a starting point. Honesty about where you are is the only place from which you can go anywhere else. And that movement begins not with a technique, but with a question asked seriously. If you made it here, you probably recognized something. And recognizing is already different from ignoring. Drop a word in the comments, just one if you want. What do you think you walled off without realizing?